today, and we'd like to welcome everyone to our cover crop session today with our commercial ag educator, Talon Becker. I'd like to introduce Talon. He's a commercial ag educator that facilitates and conducts research projects at the Ewing Demonstration Center, as well as within the Great Southern Illinois region. Talon helps with field days at Ewing Demonstration Center, collaborating with on-campus specialists and local community colleges, corresponds with clients, conducts field visits for agronomy-related questions, and presents at community meetings, extension programs, and other events. And he co-organizes the annual crop management conferences. We want to welcome Talon today, and I appreciate you coming to join us today. I know you've been busy with field days and getting everything going, so we appreciate your time. Again, we like to welcome everyone. We'll ask everyone to remain their videos off and muted during the presentation. You're welcome to put your questions into the chat box, and we'll have a time for question and answers after his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. You seeing that, Chris?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so as Chris mentioned, today I'm going to be talking to you all about cover crops and soil health. You know, they kind of go hand in hand, and I'll kind of go into why that is. And even though I titled it in that order, I'm really going to cover soil health first, because I think we kind of got to get an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about soil health. As a term that has been thrown around quite a bit in the last year or two, and not always correctly, or at least how we would define it. So this is the NRCS, or the USDA definition of soil health: the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So it's more or less talking about, you know, keeping the soil in its native state, or restoring it to that native state as best we can. Functions of a healthy soil include, first and foremost, producing food, feed, fiber, and biofuels for us. At least as humans, that's what we're worried about. Also, capturing, filtering, and storing water, cycling and recycling nutrients, resilience to the weather extremes, protect plants from pathogens and stress, store carbon and moderate the release of gases, mainly CO2, and also resist erosive forces. So the USDA NRCS organizes soil health into 4 different principles, because it just makes it easier to kind of discuss these things and learn about what we're talking about when we mean soil health, or how we foster soil health in our fields or our gardens. So these 4 principles can also be broken down into 2 main categories. Either they are protecting the soil, so you're minimizing disturbance, that's minimizing tillage, and maximizing soil cover. So protecting the soil aggregates and organic matter in that soil, or feeding the soil biology. So those would be from maximizing continuous living roots and also maximizing biodiversity. So we'll come back to those 4 principles throughout the presentation a little bit. And I think maybe it's good to step back here for a second and kind of talk about, why do we care about soil health, or what kind of launched this area of research and exploration. So this has been something that I think many farmers and people who live in rural areas might have seen from the roadside, but this aerial view kind of gives you a better look of what we're calling the fence row effect. And you can see on the left-hand side, this image has, you know, a very dark streak kind of running north and south, well, up and down through the image, that doesn't necessarily correspond with like the waterways or lower areas like what we see in the rest of the field. But if you look back at the history of that field, that was actually an old fence row. So, you know, why is that? Why do we see healthier plants generally in old fence rows for 5, 10, 15 years after that fence row is removed? And after many years of research, soil health as a general term seems to be why we see that improved agronomic growth or crop growth in those areas. And here's just another example. This image is from a gentleman named Barry Fisher, who's retired with the NRCS. This is somebody he worked with. He was from Indiana and worked with many Indiana farmers and Midwest farmers over his career. This gentleman John, or I think it's John Maloney. His field's on the left. He was a longtime no-till and cover cropper. And compared to his neighbor's field on the right, these are obviously planted similar times. Environment and weather are basically the same, but there's a major difference, obviously, in the health of the crop, at least visually, a visual appearance and the health of that crop on the left-hand side. And, he believes it can be attributed to improved soil health due to those no-till and cover cropping practices. So we're going to go in a bit of how we achieve that improved soil health, in particular, how cover crops help us achieve that with the rest of this presentation. So why cover crops? Because, well, it covers 3 of these 4 soil health principles. So it maximizes soil cover, it maximizes biodiversity, and it maximizes living roots throughout the year. So that's why cover crops are one of the major soil health practices, because it is one tool that can cover many of these different areas of soil health, or the different principles. So other than soil health, why do we care about cover crops? Well, weed suppression, I think, is the biggest, both for garden growers or vegetable production growers too, as well as row crop growers. That's what they see as their benefit, the return to investment for them. As a society, we're interested in cover crops because of nutrient loss reduction. Many of you may have heard talk of nutrient loss issues in the Mississippi River Basin, as well as the Chesapeake and the Lake Erie River Basin, or Lake Erie watershed. And what's happening is basically we're putting on fertilizer at rates that we're losing some to the environment. They are rates higher than what the plants need. Oftentimes we're going to lose some fertilizer through leaching and or runoff, but maximizing our soil cover, minimizing erosion, maximizing our ability to sequester those nutrients prior to it being lost into groundwater or tile lines, maybe in northern Illinois. That is how cover crops can help reduce this issue. So nutrient loss can lead to eutrophication or hypoxic zones, like in the Gulf and in Chesapeake, where it can affect the marine life that's in that area. So that's one of the reasons why, as a society, and this doesn't happen just in the US, this is a worldwide issue that many people are trying to figure out how can we optimize agronomic production to both feed a growing population but also not negatively impact our environment. And finally, through improved soil health, cover crops can improve water infiltration and holding capacity. They can improve aggregate stability, which we'll talk about what all that means a little bit more. It can increase organic matter to a point. Now, there's different native soil types, and then the organic matter that is present in that native soil type. You might be able to get slightly above that native state, but it does appear that there are maximum thresholds to what organic matter can be increased by cover cropping and no-till practices. And lastly, microbial biodiversity and nutrient cycling, which we'll go into more detail as well. So first off, with weed suppression, this chart here, this graph can show you here. This is one of many that appear like this throughout the literature, but this is a good example of cover crop biomass and its relation to Amaranthus palmeri, or Palmer amaranth, control at 6 weeks after planting. So after planting of the cash crop. Cotton, you can see, is a cash crop in this example, which is on the very bottom. So this is looking at the weed suppression of just that cover crop. And I have kind of highlighted an area here on this graph where we would call a typical range of biomass for overwintering cover crop in Illinois, at least in row crops. It's possible to get above this amount, which is shown in kilograms per hectare, but it's pretty close to, I think it's 0.89 kilograms per hectare to tons per acre. So 2,000 kilograms per hectare would be a little under a ton per acre of dry biomass. So I'd say we ranged anywhere from 3/4 of a ton to 2 tons dry weight biomass from a cover crop in a row crop production field seeded at a certain population. Again, if you are not too worried about biomass, if you're in a small vegetable production system where you're just maybe planting cover crops between rows. You're not worried about mechanical planting through that biomass. Then you could probably go on this higher end and ramp it up to get pretty close to full product or full weed control, Palmer amaranth. And but yeah, this is what we see typically for cover crop control of weeds. These are pictures of a trial that we had at Ewing here a few years back, just looking at single species cover crop with and without that cover crop and how it affected the weed emergence. And there was different herbicide programs within this experiment too. But for the sake of this talk, all we need to look at here is just no cover versus cover. So the cereal rye is on your right hand side, and that's at, it's probably early heading right there. I think it may have flowered, but probably not quite yet. And even though you can see quite a bit of space down through those plants, because most of the leaves have dropped at this point in time, then it still does a great job suppressing the emergence of those broadleaves, which are mainly water hemp over on the left hand side there. So and these plots are right next to each other. I put the images together so you can see them both head on, but they are right next to each other. So it wasn't like it was two different parts in the field. And it seems water hemp and mare's tail in particular seem to be very sensitive to that growing grass cover crop for weeds, for the suppression of their growth. And it could be shading, allelopathy, a couple different things, which we'll talk about here in a bit. This is from a vegetable trial and looking at biomass cover crop or biomass of cover crops for these are different grass cover crops. If you look at these papers, they'll have some for some legumes and some brassicas as well, but grass cover crops are going to be your major weed suppressors because they put on the most biomass. The other types of cover crops, legumes, brassicas, forbs, are going to be put in for other functional reasons generally, and not as much for weed suppression. But anyways, so yeah, you can get quite a bit of biomass again from all these. On the far left side, Lolium multiflorum is annual ryegrass, better known as. And then the A sativa is oats. S cereale is cereal rye. S bicolor, sorghum. T estivum, wheat, Triticum estivum. And then S vulgare is Sudan grass. And sorghum and Sudan grass are pretty closely related. So S vulgare is one that you don't really see in the literature anymore. Usually everything is called S bicolor with a subspecies name attached to it. So here's biomass, and then going to next is the weed dry biomass. So the previous slide, biomass of the cover crop, and this is the biomass of the weeds following that cover crop. And more or less, there is a correlation between biomass and weed control. Again, just showing that it correlates to in vegetable production systems as well as the row crop production systems. And compared to control is quite a bit better for all 6 of the cover crops tested here. Yeah. So again, I mentioned this big word allelopathy. Many times, I'd say it's probably too often recognized as the reason for why cover crops have weed suppression activity. Allelopathy refers to the release of a certain chemical, phytochemical, often called secondary metabolites as well, from a plant that will inhibit the germination and or growth of another plant. So while we do know that there are allelopathic compounds in some of these crops, it's very hard to prove that's the only thing happening there. Or in some of these cover crops, I should say, it's hard to prove it's the only thing happening there. You really have to do it with isolated compounds in like the lab. Doing it in situ or in the field is very difficult because it's always confounded with this shading effect that you're going to get from cover crops as well. So many weed seeds, particularly small weed seeds, have light cues that induce germination. So they need to intercept a certain amount of light, whether it be UV, sometimes it might be far red light, in order to germinate. And that's an evolutionary mechanism so that these small seeded weeds don't try to germinate when they're too deep in the soil. Anybody around here may have, if you drill something in or do a little bit of tillage, you might start pretty clean, but as soon as you break that soil open, you're going to get a whole bunch of seeds start to come up because they're just a little bit too deep to begin with. And then just getting a little closer to that surface starts that germination queue. And many hard, small seeded weeds their seed bank can remain in the soil for many years. Sometimes it's a few years, but I know there's some weed seeds that can stay viable for 10 plus years in the soil. This is now more in a field crop production lens. You might be able to reduce your herbicide application passes and or delay applications of pre-residuals, so pre-emergence residuals. A big asterisk here, you need a uniform stand. Obviously, the soil shading and allelopathic effects, the weed suppressive effects are going to depend largely on biomass in that area and not just on an acreage basis. So many farmers are kind of playing around with planting what we call planting green or planting the cash crop into the unterminated cover crop, coming back later on and either terminating that cover crop directly after planting, or maybe coming back a week or two later and terminating the cover crop then. This is tricky. You don't want to start this out. Soybeans are easier to do this with. In general, the higher seeding rate and the ability for the soybean plant to branch allows it to recover from possibly seed loss due to seedling disease or seed rot. Corn is less flexible. Some people are planting green with corn into legumes, and then terminating that later on. But if you're talking about a grass cover crop, you generally don't want to have a whole lot of grass biomass that you're planting corn into. We'll talk a bit why that is here in a little bit later. And so possibly in more production vegetable systems, this last point could be pertinent. So cover crops could be used in combination with more directed herbicide applications over the row to minimize selection pressure of herbicides on weed populations. So herbicide resistant weeds are becoming an issue nationwide in row crop systems, and my guess would be vegetable production systems to some extent as well. So utilizing cover crops between the rows and then herbicides in the rows could be a way to kind of mix up the modes of action that you're utilizing on the weeds in any one given field and given year, minimizing the chance for herbicide resistance evolution. So what are the soil health benefits of cover crops, or what are the benefits of good soil health, maybe is a better way of saying that. So biologically, we are stimulating the soil biology by having those cover crops in, having that living root year round. We're building soil organic matter and carbon. We are increasing the nutrient cycling again, and that is largely from the microbes that we are fostering, and disease suppression, again, from having a diverse microbial population in that soil. So how do we feed the microbes is with the cover crops, I think is the next question many people might be wondering. And the short answer is root exudates. So as the name suggests, root exudates are compounds that are exuded from roots. This could be, well, any plant has root exudates because pretty much every plant has a symbiosis with some microbes in the soil. So they've co-evolved to usually develop, we know about legumes and rhizobia have that symbiosis in the nodules of soybeans. So rhizobium bacteria in nodules of soybeans will take carbohydrates, root exudates from the soybean and supply it with ammonium, nitrogen. And that happens on certain occasions within those plant structures, those nodules, but oftentimes these are free living bacteria or fungi that interact with plants and have these symbioses. So in general, increasing plant diversity also increases the types of exudates that are putting out into the soil, which increases your microbial diversity. Generally a good thing, just because it's kind of like hedging your bets, I guess you'd say. Having more diversity out there, the populations will shift depending upon what is needed by the plant population out there, but having that diversity to start with kind of has a seed bank, if you want to think about it that way, of those microbes that can increase or decrease depending upon climate, weather, plants present, all that kind of stuff. So how are we adding carbon to the system and organic matter is another big point of cover crops. And of course, the biomass is sequestering carbon from the biomass has carbon that is sequestered from the atmosphere in the form of CO2. Plants uptake CO2 and make that into sugars and starches that build the plant out. They form the structure of that plant. But the research has shown that really above ground biomass does not seem to be incorporated into what we call stable organic matter, and does not increase what you would see as your OM, your organic matter percent on a soil test. Roots do to some extent, we believe, but not well studied because of how difficult it is to study roots, being they're below ground, harder to harvest intact. In particular, you're never going to get all of the root system, just because roots go down generally at least as far as the top as the plant height does into the air. So if you have a 6-foot plant, you generally have at least 6 foot of roots going down. A little animation here. So plant carbon has come from the atmospheric CO2. This is active organic matter carbon. That carbon gets munched down by the microbes, or that organic matter, and the microbes are utilizing this organic matter for their own metabolism, their own reproduction, and that increases the microbial biomass carbon. There is some respiration of CO2 in this process that is going to happen no matter what. It's just how life works. There's always going to be some CO2 respired, except for with plants, of course. But it's actually the dead microbes that seem to be leading to increased soil organic matter composition. So dead microbes, more so than above ground plant biomass, seem to be contributing to the organic matter increase that we see with some long-term no-till and cover crop systems. Yep. So secondly, the nutrient cycling is supposed to be increased with microbes, and this is the nitrogen cycle, just a very common example of nutrient cycling. But we see here where I've circled in yellow that bacteria are involved in many steps of this process. Not only the nitrogen fixing, as you mentioned, with the root bacteria that form symbioses with legumes, but also bacteria that do nitrification steps, bacteria that decompose the organic matter into ammonium and ammonia, and other steps as well. Now, we talked a lot about bacteria, but we haven't talked about fungi yet. So, I think most people probably think of fungi as a bad thing, especially vegetable gardeners. There's all kinds of fungal diseases. Besides the fungi that we eat, the mushrooms, most fungi we come into contact with are not very good, or at least from our perspective. But there are a class of fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or just mycorrhizal fungi generally, that are very important for plant growth. These fungi, again, form symbioses, or they form complexes with roots in order to share nutrients. Mycorrhizal fungi are often involved with phosphorus mining or uptake from deeper parts of the soil profile that plant roots do not reach. They relocate it to closer to the plant. The plant's giving off carbohydrates and other exudates that the fungi can then utilize and for their growth. So again, symbioses all over the place. And lastly, well, not lastly, but here we're talking about plant microbe interactions. So root exudates also influence which microbes are living nearby. As I mentioned, the populations will change throughout a given year depending upon weather, and also depending upon what plants are growing in that area. So chemicals released chemicals released can change based upon plant stress. So different plant stresses can maybe change the exudates that are being released by that plant, which can signal things to the microbes. It can maybe recruit certain microbes to say there's a pathogen that's affecting this plant. Many plants have evolved secondary metabolites that they'll release to signal microbes that maybe, and or nematodes possibly, that are predators, or that infect that pathogen. even pathogens have something that infect it. So everything's trying to eat each other constantly in the world of life. So it's a way of, this is an area of research that is pretty new, and still we're learning a lot. But over the last 5-10 years, we started to learn a lot about this microbiome that's within the soil and how it affects plant health. And I think a good analogy that many of you may have heard of is the microbiome that's in our guts and how that affects our health. So we're learning more and more about all the bacteria that are in our guts and how they affect our ability to digest, to fight off certain pathogens ourselves. So I guess the way I think about it is that the soil is the plant's gut. So mammals have the gut microbes, soil is the plant's gut. So there's still a lot to learn about these things and how important they are for plant health, and maybe how we can optimize these systems for agronomic crop production to improve efficiency again and minimize environmental impact while feeding a growing population. So beyond the biology aspects of soil health, we also have protective aspects. So building and protecting soil aggregates is a major goal of soil health, which can then improve your infiltration and improve trafficability of that ground. So when we're talking about soil aggregates, here's just kind of an initial image that we can kind of talk about what this means. So soil aggregates, when you have stable soil aggregates, like what you see on the left here, water can infiltrate through between those aggregates, and rather than on the right-hand side where you see minimal aggregates and lots of loose sediment that will crust, especially after hard rains, and cause more runoff rather than infiltration. So that's improved aggregate stability, or improved soil aggregates, is a good thing, not only for the crop, but also for those nutrient loss issues we were talking about, and flooding issues that we're seeing in many parts of the country right now. Flash flooding is probably going to be becoming more and more common if we do continue to see increases in the rates of intense rainstorms. So having more of that water go into the ground rather off of it, I think is better for everybody, not just farmers or garden growers. And some more talk about what aggregate stability leads to. We talked about crusting a little bit, and that crusting can lead to ponding, runoff and erosion. You can see on the bottom right side just how, I think everybody's seen a field like this, is how silty that is. And if you're seeing soil come off a field that's very silty, there's no aggregates in that. It's just the pure components of the aggregates. So what are soil aggregates made up of? So there are macro aggregates and micro aggregates. Macro aggregates are composed of micro aggregates, and within these are silt and clay particles, microbes, particular organic matter, fungi, and many of the compounds that these bacteria and fungi produce is what kind of holds things together like a glue in these aggregates. And this pore space that's within that is what can suck up water and increase your water holding capacity of a soil. So on the top, you see glycoproteins on soil aggregates. So this is just a staining of a certain kind of protein that is common to arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, that they will actually put a fluorescent protein into the fungi and then grow it in soil and then fluoresce that with a special microscope. And that's what you're seeing there. And on the bottom, again, this is the mycelia that helps to stabilize the microaggregates. Mycelia is just the web-like portion of fungi that grow below ground generally. Anywhere you see mushrooms growing, there's 20 times, 100 times more mycelia growing below ground. It's not the fuzzy stuff that you might see in many like gray molds and that kind of stuff, but it's stuff that grows throughout the cells that it is disrupting and pulling the nutrients out of. So the mycelia can kind of be thought of as like the root of the fungi. A mushroom or fruiting body is more like the seed producing part of it, although it's not exactly the same thing. I think it's a good way of thinking about it. So finally, what are the soil health benefits of cover crops? We've kind of gone over protection of soil organic matter, and in some cases increasing it, increased water infiltration, lower risk of compaction by that improved trafficability, and then also resistance to erosion. So those are four major things that we see are soil health benefits for, especially for row crop farmers. Compaction on a garden isn't going to be as much of an issue, but it's not a bad thing to have improved aggregate stability, and improved soil tilth is another way people might have talked about before. Just a fluffier soil, I guess. More aeration, better gas exchange for roots, for your cash crops or your vegetables. Okay, so out of the soil health portion of the talk into kind of more in depth into cover crops. So when you're just getting started with cover crops, which it looks like many people maybe have, it looks like about half have tried it before, but not with a ton of experience, I think. So first, I think you want to consider your goals and objectives. There are many different cover crop species. Many of these species are really just forage species that are also utilized as cover crops. Some people, you will plant a cover crop, harvest part of that as a forage, but still utilize as a cover crop for the cash crop following. So integrating all these systems, I think, is part of how we utilize cover crops better, especially when we're integrating animal ag more into our landscape. So, just a four common goals, I guess you'd say, with row crop systems in particular is end scavenging, weed suppression, building soil organic matter, stimulating soil biodiversity. So once you have your goals, I would suggest everyone kind of check out this tool if you want to try utilizing cover crops. There is currently only a row crop tool, although it's going to be very similar information as to what the vegetable tool is. There's a vegetable tool that's in production right now, but in terms of at least seeding rates and when you can seed things, different species, I think even the row crop tool will be a good place to start for people. And there's a lot of information we'll go into here. So if you go to the Midwest Cover Crop Council's decision tool, if you just Google Midwest Cover Crop Council cover crop tool, you'll get there. You can select, what state and county your farm is in. So that's giving you recommendations based upon weather and climate data from that county. And then you select your goals. I just put one here, soil builder, but you can add more goals. And when you get the results out, it'll kind of give you a score for each of those goals that you put in. Also, there's options down here you can play around with. I have them displayed in cover crop by type and group cover crops by type. So after you submit your query, you can get this, you'll get something like this back. You'll see here, green means reliable establishment. Yellow is more of risky, but it could still work often, especially if you have favorable weather. And here I said, this is only the top part of the list, but you can see the types. So there's grasses, legumes, below there's brassicas, and they have a few mix options in there as well. So for building, soil builder was my goal for this cover crop. This is the score that highlights how good that cover crop is at building the soil. And same for end fixation, all those things would give you different scores. So we generally see winter cereal rye or annual ryegrass are two very common cover crops utilized in our area, especially in row crops, particularly because of the late planting window that you have with those. Cereal rye, we've drilled it in mid-November before and gotten pretty good stands the next spring. You don't see anything that fall, not until it warms up, but the seed will overwinter pretty well in the ground. Annual ryegrass, not quite as much, but you can frost seed it. So that's what that little snowflake means. You can frost seed these things as well. So I think this is just a good decision tool, is a good place to kind of start for information on these many questions people have when they're starting with cover crops. And if you click on any of those names of the cover crops, they'll take you to an information sheet. And each of these sections will expand if you click on them to give you more information. So for cereal rye, is saying, planting information, drilled seed depth, 3/4 to 1.5 inches, drilled seeding rate, 30 to 90 pounds, pretty wide seeding rate, again, depending upon how much biomass per acre you want. Having too much biomass per acre can be an issue with mechanically planted fields. So It really, and also when you plant it. So if you're planting in mid-September versus early November, you're going to get a whole lot more biomass per pound of seed in the earlier planting, because that plant's going to have more time to establish and tiller and all that kind of thing, all those kind of things. So drilling seed rates are generally lower than broadcasting seed rates. You're going to have more seedling loss from broadcasting, and there's all kinds of information on these pages that you can find as a starting point. So using cover crops in vegetable production, whether for a garden or for a larger scale production system, then there are at least a couple of considerations you got to make that are different. Well, slightly different sometimes than row crop systems. I guess both row crops and vegetables, planting and termination method and timing are big decisions you got to kind of make. So we talked a little bit about planting timing. You want to get a good establishment period. When with row crop systems, we're generally saying in this area, as soon as you get the field out, the field harvested, you want to put that cover crop in there. So earlier the better. You're going to get more growing degree days per calendar day in mid-October than you are in late October by almost double. The growing degree days really start to go down by end of October, early November. Some cover crops will winter kill, particularly like spring grasses or some of the brassicas. Like often a winter kill mixes around here would be what they call an oat and radish or an oat turnip mix. So spring oats, not winter oats. And like a daikon type of radish, a tillage radish often is what's called too. One of those radishes with the long white tuber. Roller crimper is another common method, particularly starting to gain some traction for both row crop systems and vegetable production systems, I believe. That's pictured up here on the top right. So you can see there's the chevron pattern that will crimp the base of that cover crop, and it won't kill everything, but it'll kill usually 80-90% if you do it at the right stage. The optimal stage for roller crimping grasses is at boot stage. So when that head's just starting to pop out, that's when the stems are stiff enough to actually break and won't just kind of pop back up in a couple days. I think you could do it after that too, but that's as early as you want to do it. Undercutting is another method that utilizes a sweep plow, I believe is what it's called. And you don't see this very often around here. It's just something I came across in my readings on this, but it's not a no-till method, and you really can't do it if the biomass gets too big, because the roots will be there'll be too many roots basically to cut through without a ton of horsepower. So a less utilized method than some of these other ones. Mowing, particularly with a flail mower, which you see on the bottom here, is more common, I think, in vegetable production, particularly because you might have a field that you put the cover crops, and then you're putting in raised beds, plastic covered beds or something into that field. So you can just mow the whole thing and then till up your bed space and keep that other cover crop living, or at least the mulch in place between those rows. Herbicides are a common way, especially in row crop production. Roundup, glyphosate is used, and 2,4-D are probably the two most common products that are used. Roundup still does a great job of most grasses, and all these cover crops are selected to be herbicide susceptible, so they do generally get killed relatively easily. The one exception to that, or major exception I say to that, would be annual ryegrass. You want to make sure if you're going to use an herbicide to terminate annual ryegrass that it's been several days, 3 or 4 days of 55, 60 degree weather, so that annual ryegrass is actively growing and it will take up the glyphosate and kill the plant. Otherwise, you'll probably have to come back and kill it or hit it again. And so, lastly, natural maturity. Some cover crops, in some systems, it works out that you can just let them go to seed. They'll go to seed in early spring, and that seed will not germinate again until late summer, early fall. So if you just kind of mow it off after it's seeded, some cover crops are at least purported to not cause major issues with crop competition, just through letting them go to seed as an annual, and then they kind of reseed themselves to some extent. And second, I think tillage and bed preparation is something that vegetable people need to think about too. So too much biomass can definitely cause issues with tillage equipment. I think that's kind of people who have tilled things can understand things can wrap around discs or wrap around tillage implements. So you want to, if you're planning to till any area that has cover crops, you probably want to terminate that a little sooner rather than later. And this one's a little wordy, but there are some disadvantages to cover crops as well, or potential disadvantages, I should say. They don't always happen every year, but something just to kind of keep in mind and that you might have to plan for. So to start this list off, we could provide habitat for pests with cover crops. Something we've seen in row crops are, and particularly soybeans, are voles and slugs. Voles obviously will create runs and nests in the winter cover crop, and the more biomass you have, the more that biomass is standing straight up, or kind of creating a canopy, the more production that is for voles and slugs. Their predators are usually hunting from the air, so if they can hide below the canopy and the predators can't see them, that's a habitat they love. So yeah, rolling down biomass can really help with those two pests, or those types of pests. Armyworm or other herbivorous insects or their larvae are other issues. Particularly if you have a really lush green cover crop that you've terminated and put a cash crop in right away, those armyworms might be chowing away on that grass that you have in there and then move right into your tomatoes or peppers or whatever it might be. So usually termination of grass cover crops a week or two prior to planting can help minimize that. They will move on somewhere else rather than your cash crop, and then you'll have less local population when you put your cash crop in. And also, these cover crop systems can also increase your predatory insects. So that often helps maintain equilibrium. We generally don't use insecticides at our farm just because we don't need to. We have obviously small plot farms. We have a pretty diverse setup, and we don't really see levels ever get above what we call threshold for spray. So we did have a decent amount of armyworm damage here this past several weeks with the fall armyworm outbreak that happened in this region. But again, it was like 10% maybe defoliation, not what we consider a threshold for making an insecticide application. Cover crops can also provide a green bridge, or that's often what's called, for some diseases. This is particularly if the cover and the cash crops are related species. So like with mammals, we can catch diseases from other mammals sometimes, but it's much less likely we're going to catch diseases from, I don't know, a fish or something. So the more closely related the species are, the more likely a pathogen is able to infect both of those species. You could compete with the cash crop if you don't fully terminate it, or some people are doing intercropping or planting cover crops between rows. If you don't get those cleared off in the rows, there could be some competition. Shading, I think, would probably be the major issue. Nutrient competition isn't as much of an issue if you have good fertility. So yeah, I think again, rolling down cover crops is a good practice for minimizing the competition with the cash crop. Weed control can be incomplete if you have spotty stands and or diminishes over time. So as the residue breaks down, you're going to have breaks in that weed control. So it's not a season-long solution often, but it can, a good biomass cover or a good residue cover can often give you at least 30 days and maybe up to 60 days of good weed suppression. Enough time to hopefully get canopy set in the rows. Difficulty planting through residue. If you are mechanically planting, then you definitely want to have something that can, with enough down pressure and or weight, that can get through the residue. Rolling the residue first. Some people think it helps, some people don't. There's lots of opinions on this type of thing. Utilizing row cleaners on like a planter or spiked wheels that can help kind of clear out that residue. Some people like that, but again, if you have lots of biomass, it could wrap those up. So it really depends on what species you're using and when you're terminating, all those types of things. If you have a crispy cover crop, something that's been terminated 2 weeks ago, it's going to be much more friable, or much easier to break with a planter. But if you have something that is terminated 3 days ago and it's kind of starting to yellow, you get what we call ropey, then that's going to be much less easy to break or cut through with planter discs and that kind of thing. And lastly, nutrient immobilization or tie-up, particularly nitrate and ammonium. So we talked about sequestering nutrients with the cover crop, the nutrients the cover crop actually uptakes and sequesters in its biomass, but also nutrient immobilization can happen during biomass decomposition. So the microbes that are breaking down the biomass can actually take nitrate out of the soil or ammonium out of the soil to help with their metabolism while they are breaking down that biomass. And that's generally only for grass cover crops or cover crops that have what they call a high C to N ratio or carbon to nitrogen ratio. Legume and brassica cover crops tend to have more balanced or higher nitrogen in that ratio. Grass cover crops have a higher carbon ratio, which means the microbes need more nitrate than they can get from the biomass itself in order to run their own metabolism. So it takes them out of the soil. So utilizing mixes of legumes and grasses can help kind of offset that immobilization effect, and or applying a synthetic fertilizer to kind of feed the microbes almost, if you will help minimize their immobilization from soil nitrate. And lastly, go through a couple of resources that I found that I think for vegetable production systems that maybe be worth looking a little more into. They are open source online and available. So this one's from Iowa State Extension, Cover Crops and Vegetable Production Systems. It's kind of similar to what the Midwest Cover Crop Council tool is doing, but in a table format. So you can just see here, they're giving suggested seeding rates, planting times, what you can expect for biomass from those. And now this is Iowa, so adjust accordingly, I guess you'd say, depending upon where you're at in our state. You're going to get more growing degree days down south, obviously, than you would in most of Iowa. And the Rodale Institute's another, I guess it's a nonprofit organization that has done a lot of no-till organic cover crop research over the years. They are located out in Pennsylvania. So again, adjust accordingly for climatic changes. But this one goes into a bit more, and this is just one table of many they have. I would suggest looking this whole table up on their website, Rodale Institute, choosing the best cover crops for your organic no-till vegetable system is the name of the webpage. And again, it gives you seeding depth, seeding rates, hardiness, all kinds of different things, when to mow and roll it. This SK is a seed kill. That means you can naturally let it go to seed. FLS means flowering, or boot for grasses. And I can't remember all these different codes mean, but they are definitely on that website. I think we talked about a little bit how legumes will fix their own nitrogen. Actually, the rhizobia that the legumes have a symbiosis with will fix nitrogen. And so here are some, rough estimates basically of what a given cover crop can give you in pounds per acre of nitrogen. I think these were estimates based upon pure stands of these legumes. So if you're doing it in a mix, it's going to be different, obviously. You just kind of got to play with it. I wouldn't give yourself more than 50 pounds credit any first year you're trying any of these legume cover crops, particularly if you're in a mix. So you're crediting nitrogen from a legume. I would go on the lower end of the scale rather than the top end, and then maybe try cutting back on synthetic nitrogen that's applied here and there to see if you're seeing any plant effects, see how far back you can pull that. And then lastly here, this is another table. I won't go into much detail here, but again, this is from the Iowa State resource. And this just gives examples of vegetable production rotations with cover crops. So kind of showing how you can work these into with many different production systems, and depending upon the production, what vegetable you're producing or fruit you're producing, the cover crop might change, and what you want to get out of that cover crop. So it is something that is very dynamic and isn't, a one size fits all type of solution. But I think playing around with different cover crop species in your system and what you want to produce is something that's beneficial not only for your production, but also for has environmental benefits. We didn't talk about pollinator benefits, but obviously having something flowering more than once a year is going to be beneficial for pollinators. All kinds of benefits to having things grow throughout the year rather than just 5-6 months out of the year in many fields. And with that, I guess I'll say thank you, and I'll open up to any questions we might have. Unless, Chris, do you want me to show the video first or questions first? Chris?
It's not.
Chris, are you there? Okay. I can hear her.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chris. Can you hear me?
Okay, sorry. It's not letting me unmute for some reason. I don't know. So yeah, whichever way you want to go. If they want to put their questions in the chat box, or if you want to show the video, whatever's first.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box yet, so let's go ahead and go to the video.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure why my thing's still saying mute. So.
Okay, I had the video queued up here somewhere. Oh, it's right here. Hold on. Oop. Can you guys hear the sound on that?
No sound. No sound.
I'll just basically, I'll talk about what's going on here. So they're going to do what they call a slake test. So these are some master gardeners from Chris's unit. And a slake test is a very simple test that's not really quantitative. You're not getting numbers out of it, but it's a good way of like looking qualitatively at soil health and mainly aggregate stability. So what they have here is 2 soil samples, one from a no-till soil field and one from a conventional field. No-till is on your right, conventional on the left. They're going to put some clods in to these glass vessels, and there's a mesh kind of holding them up in there. So you can see the conventional tillage on the left already has a kind of lighter color to it. So that's usually correlated with organic matter. We might be able to guess that organic matter is a bit higher in the no-till field. And we do see some breaking apart on both sides, but in general, the conventional tillage seems to be breaking down much faster. And if you let this sit for 10-15 minutes, my guess is that you'd have no clod left on the left-hand side, just a pile of sediment in the bottom. And you'd have some soil left in the mesh on the right-hand side in the no-till field. Adding cover crops, and the longer you add cover crops, the better this is. I've seen this demonstration many different times, and there's lots of variation in your cover crop, how well it slakes or how easily it slakes off. The idea is here that on the right-hand side, the no-till with better aggregate stability allows water to get into those pores without breaking apart those aggregates. Whereas on the left-hand side, as soon as that water starts infiltrating, there's none of those glomulins, none of those glues holding those aggregates together. So you see things just slough off very quickly. Chris, do you have anything to add to that? Chris? Okay, I guess Chris doesn't have anything to add. So yeah, that's what basically a slake test is. It's a good demo for field days and that kind of thing because it's very visual. Another thing that some people do as a good demo is actually they call it soiling your undies. So you just get a pair of tidy whities, fresh hopefully, and bury them in your soil. And then if you have good soil health or good microbial activity, that cotton should be broken down pretty substantially within a month or two. If you have poor microbial activity, that cotton you could dig it out 2 months later and see very little degradation of that cotton. So, ability to break down cotton is cellulose, more or less, is plant material. So that's the microbes breaking that down and utilizing it for their own metabolism. But if you have a sterile soil with little microbial activity, then you don't see that breakdown. Anything else, Chris? Oh, we got some chat questions now here. So one from, so any cover crop recommendations for small backyard gardens to plant in the fall and overwinter? So if you want to overwinter, most cover crops will overwinter. I think if you want to have something that's going to provide a whole lot of mulch, those cereal rye and annual ryegrasses, wheat are good options. They probably terminate right around boot and then lay down if you can. Legumes, most legumes will overwinter around here in Southern Illinois. The options get a little bit less up in Southern or up in Northern Illinois. So I think, crimson clover is one we often use, berseem, balanza. Those are legumes that have some winter hardiness. Red clover would be one that has probably the most winter hardiness, or something you could also frost seed in February. So you might not want to put it out in the fall, but you wait till the ground's frozen and broadcast it into your standing cereal rye or oats or I'm sorry, wheat or whatever your overwintering crop might be. And that will give you a good mix. And brassicas are similar. If you get them out there early, they will probably winter kill. If they are in the seed form or frost seeded, then they'll probably overwinter and then come up early in the spring. But again, wherever you're at, I would suggest looking at that Midwest Cover Crop Council's seed tool to kind of get a good idea of what works for your area. So one saying the one on the left, more soil erosion and poor production. So yeah, that it's a conventional soil, so it's been tilled many times generally. The more tillage you do, the less aggregate stability you're going to have, which can lead to more erosion. And not always poor production, depends on the year, I guess you'd say, but that's why a lot of people like to till, is because it can lead to increased seedling pop-up early on because the soil is warm earlier. I didn't mention this. I'm glad you brought this up. So one of the big major downsides, I guess, to cover crops too is that early season soil temperature. So the shading and the increased water infiltration and water holding capacity, those are all great things in the middle of summer, but early in the year in particular, you can have a few degrees cooler soils, and those few degrees can make a big difference if you're talking about 55 versus 58 in how quickly seeds will germinate and get going. So yeah, too much tillage, definitely a bad thing. Some tillage, strip tillage, maybe we'll optimize these types of things. In row crop production, what we're seeing people move towards in some instances is what they're calling precision cover cropping. So they're putting overwintering species between the rows, and using RTK or GPS guidance, we know exactly where the rows are going to be from year to year. So within the row, the cash crop row for next year, you put something that will winter kill. So that way you have a kind of a blank spot there in the spring, whereas the overwintering stuff is starting to come back in the spring. And then some people run through with a strip till implement, especially for corn, and do a little bit of tillage right there in that, just in that row, and keeping the 30 inches between the rows, no till. So there are ways to optimize both of these things, I think. Can you comment on the use of cover crops as a biofumigant? Sure. So biofumigation, sometimes biofumigation and allelopathy are synonymous, sometimes they're not. Depends if allelopathy refers to inhibition of plants. Biofumigation can be used to talk about inhibition of nematodes or other pathogens. The most common biofumigant cover crop would be Nebraska cover crops. So, and that's because they have a compound called glucosinolates that they produce, or a class of compounds, I should say. Nebraska crops, so cover crops, this includes the radish, the oilseed radish, turnips, and canola sometimes uses a cover crop. But these also include, many vegetables that we eat: cauliflower, broccoli, kohlrabi, kale, cabbage, all those crucifers or brassicas, they have glucosinolates, but they have different kinds of glucosinolates in different species, and different varieties within species, and different tissues within a variety. So biofumigation is generally utilizing these kinds of cover crops that will once tilled under, will release those compounds that can have effects on microbes, especially pathogenic microbes. It's a very complex system, I guess you'd say, that we don't fully understand, but that's the general idea, is using cover crops that will release certain active compounds. Again, in case of Nebraska's, often glucosinolates, and actually they're what they call hydrolysis products, or after the glucose molecule is taken off, you have a side chain that rearranges based upon different, the chemistry of the soils and or presence absence of different proteins, specifier proteins that can form different types of hydrolysis products. So again, very complicated, but often utilized as cover crops that are often utilized as biofumigants are brassicas, because they create glucosinolates that have been shown in some cases to decrease certain nematode populations and or decrease certain pathogen populations. Okay, I need weed suppression. My soil is high organic matter. I do not use herbicides. That's more of a comment. So yeah, weed suppression, again, your grasses are going to be your major weed suppressors. So if you have high organic matter and plenty of nitrogen available already, then maybe just going with a brassica cover crop mix would be a good way of going about it. And then lastly, just says thank you. So I don't see any more questions in the chat box. If I miss anybody's question, please feel free to maybe unmute and chime in right now. Okay. I think we got them all covered, Chris.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. I don't know, it wouldn't let me unmute or anything. I lost all functions on my Zoom there for a minute. I'm not sure. So thank you again, Talon, for joining us today. We had some great information. If they have any questions for you, can they reach out to you or send an email or any of those?
tbecker2@illinois.edu. I think I probably have it on my PowerPoint somewhere. Hold on, let me pull that back up. Oh, you're not seeing my screen anymore. But yeah, tbecker2@illinois.edu. Google Talon Becker, Illinois. I'll probably be the top result. Not many Talons out there. Yep. I'll send you, Chris, I'll send you the PDF of this PowerPoint slide if you want to.
Thank you. Yeah, and we can attach that and send it. If they have any questions on a raised bed, like when they're starting out with the garden, if they're wanting to use just a small, maybe a trial run in a raised bed, what would be like the first crop that you would suggest as a cover crop for them to use that first time? Is there a certain one that you really recommend, as a beginner to use?
I mean, the easiest always is cereal rye. Cereal rye is our beginner. If you want something that will winter kill, maybe we should say if you're gonna go into a raised bed, and it's not easy to kind of terminate that necessarily without herbicides. So if you don't want to use herbicides, you can't really get a whole lot else up in there. You can't get a roller crimper up in there. So maybe winter kill is a better option. So oats and turnip and oats and radish, spring barley, any spring grains, spring wheat, will winter kill. Just make sure you're not getting the winter grains version of that species. So
okay,
I think, yeah, for raised beds in particular, and put a legume in there, get yourself a little bit of nitrogen. Probably doesn't hurt. It all depends on basically what you have to terminate that whenever that's planting time comes around.
Okay. And also the other question I had was on trap crops. So if you're doing a cover crop system, they sometimes will talk about having a trap crop. Is that going to be kind of competing with each other, or should you not even consider a trap crop if you're going to do a cover crop?
You're talking about a trap crop for insect pests?
For insect pests as you're going, yeah. So sometimes they'll recommend that. So just kind of your recommendations on that. Either or, should you just kind of focus on one of your goals and use it for more of a soil building or something like that instead?
I would say, well, so in row crop production, because we are usually terminating and planting pretty early in the spring before insect populations are very high, we don't worry about it. But I could see in vegetable production, particularly for vegetables that are planted, late June, July, like more summer planted stuff. Yeah, maybe leaving an area of cover crop that you don't terminate, that's not going to be production field as your trap. So when after you terminate where your production is going to go, all the insects go into that trap area. Maybe that's beneficial. I don't know of any research on it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just don't know of any. It's not my area of expertise per se. But I can see how that could possibly be beneficial to move them into that lush foliage and out of the way of your cash crop and give them kind of something to chew on so they don't come back to your cash crop 2 weeks later. I can see how that could possibly help.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your time. We won't take up too much more of your time today, and we appreciate it. If anyone has any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to pass that along. We'll also plan on posting this onto our YouTube channel, and we'll share that with your marketing team to also, Talon, and get that out there for everyone to review if they've missed this, today, their session. So thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. And thanks everybody for joining. Have a good afternoon.
I lost all functionality on my Zoom. Is it just my connection stone? Yes, and he was like in charge of everything. I was doing good until he switched. I'm sorry, let me go my mask. He switched thing here. Sit there a second. It's gone to this, but it won't let me record or stop or anything. Did he like take away? Because it wouldn't let me, like he could hear me talking, but it had unmuted and it like had me muted the whole time. But I can't end it. I can't stop.
It just froze. It's been a thing with Zoom lately.
Okay. I'm like, I can't do anything. It just kind of like froze right there. And he could hear me finally talk, but then he couldn't hear me at all. But I need to like record it. See what I'm saying? I had it on record. So I'm hoping I
Yeah, we're
didn't
probably
lose it.
gonna have to